This episode offers psychosocial education designed to inspire and motivate our listeners. The information provided does not constitute a therapeutic relationship nor a substitute for professional mental health care. If you are experiencing a mental health crisis, call 911, go to your nearest emergency room, or for listeners in the United States, text 988 for the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Warning, this episode contains brain food that will lead to improved emotional and social intelligence. Thanks for tuning in to Harvesting Happiness today for a healthy serving of consciously prepared brain food. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen, your host. Since 2010, we've been broadcasting sound ideas for better well-being. Each week, we spotlight diverse thinkers and doers who are contemporary trendsetters and change agents, devoting their lives to creating a better world. I invite you to listen and change how you think about human happiness. Our award-winning content is fresh, optimistic, and purpose-driven media that promotes well-being from the inside out. This episode is part of the Good Citizens Election Season Survival Guide to Restoring Common Sense and Sanity in a Crazy World, produced in collaboration with renowned, fair-minded subject matter experts who provide strategies that enhance critical thinking, increase civic engagement, and foster healthy pleasure to boost personal well-being and relationship satisfaction. You can also discover more unique bonus content at More Mental Fitness by Harvesting Happiness on Substack and Medium. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining me on Harvesting Happiness and this special edition of the Good Citizens Election Season Survival Guide, helping to restore common sense in a crazy world. Today, we're having a philosophical discourse on disappointment. My guest today is Dr. Samir Chopra, who is a philosophical counselor and professor emeritus of philosophy at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Dr. Chopra has authored and co-authored several books, including works on film, artificial intelligence, and sports. Samir is a champion of critical thinking who helps others find their way to manage anxiety and mental health through a philosophical approach. His most recent book is titled Anxiety, a Philosophical Guide. Welcome, Samir. Thanks for joining me on the show today.
Thanks very much for having me on, Lisa. Yeah, I think you're right. Whenever important momentous events happen, there are consequences and ramifications of that event having taken place. And those ramifications and consequences affect people differently, just because we're all so differently placed in our lives. And especially something like an election, for instance, has got an impactful role to play in our lives. So yeah, this is a great topic to be talking about today.
Yeah. So let's talk about the root of disappointment. When we are disappointed, it's because some event that we thought was going to go one way went the opposite, right? Our expectations were not met. I think it really comes down to that, like crystallizing what happens to us when we're in disappointment.
Right. Yeah. And I think those expectations are not insignificant because when we have expectations, our imagination works with those expectations to construct a certain kind of vision of the world that awaits us, where our expectations to be realized. And that world is not just an ordinary world, it's a world that we inhabit. So it's not just that we expect a particular world, it's that we expect a particular future for ourselves. We see ourselves as playing a particular role in that world. So it's not just that some things will not come to us, but we won't be the person that we want to be in this world that we see coming up, right?
That is a very good point.
So I think that disappointment can run quite deep. And I think sometimes when people are trying to explain why they are quite as let down or crestfallen as they are, when an unfavorable result happens in these kinds of situations, is because they're literally seeing a kind of vision of life crumble in front of them. And in some ways, what I think we need to be talking about is what reconstructing a new vision of the life you are going to have is going to look like. What does it mean to pick up those pieces? Because one sort of, I think, poetic way I like to think about it is you've constructed this picture, the pieces have fallen apart, you've got to pick them up and put them back again. But now you need to construct a different picture with it.
Do you recommend looking externally first or internally? Like in the sense, like for me, when I'm disappointed, I will say, okay, what I wanted, the outcome was not as I had desired or envisioned. And yet the constancy that's out there in the world is the sun will rise, the sun will set, the moon will rise, the moon will set, the birds will chirp. And that is a constant that I can rely upon.
Very much. And, actually, thank you for mentioning the constants that we can rely upon, because another thing that we need to rely upon or could rely upon, or I would say even should rely upon, is that these constants that remain in our life, amongst them are the duties that we have to other people, right? For example, let's say we are parents, we are children who have depend on us. If I'm a teacher, as I was back in 2016, when I was teaching at the time of the first Trump election, I would say, I have my students who are depending on me to go to classroom and teach. So I think there's a sense of not just those constants, but also what is expected of me and who are the people that are depending on me. And they expect me to come back and punch in and get to work in some ways. So as great as my disappointment might be, one of the things that should anchor me in helping me, as it were, rise out of this funk, dependent on me at this time, to be functioning in the ways that I could be or should be, and to in some ways, as a sanity restoring measure, get back to work in those domains as well, right?
This is a great point. For those people who are listening who may be in that state of disappointment or disillusionment or depression, the idea that we have to show up for others, that we have to maintain our families, we have to go to work, we have to perform as needed to meet those responsibilities can be a great anchor. And the way in which we do it, I think, is also equally as important.
Yes, very much so. If you think about it, when you are showing up for others, you are not being selfish, you're not being self-centered, you're taking the focus off yourself, you're engaging in service. And I think this is a very deep principle, I think, in any kinds of mental health, that most of the times when we are having quote unquote mental problems or mental health issues, it's because there is a concern about ourselves. We're inwardly focused. And one of the best ways to take the focus of our concerns and our worries is to be there for others, to, as it were, unself ourselves, right? Take that focus of concern from just being directed inwards and directed at others, not necessarily at external objects, though I suspect going for a walk by the pond or, gazing at beautiful works of art will help as well. But I think foremost among those ways of taking the focus of ourselves has to be the service of others, right? So, and I think being fully present for people, I think is also important. These aren't easy tasks in some ways. These are challenging. But I think in taking the focus of our disappointment, the service of others is perhaps the most important duty that I can think of.
While also maintaining self-care, right? If one is in a state of extreme anxiety or depression where it's hard to get out of bed, which I've heard stories of this from very, very close friends who I was very surprised to learn that this was how they were feeling. How can we support that? How do we explain to people, in order to eat the elephant, you have to do it one bite at a time. So maybe it's just maybe baby steps, to restore sanity.
Very much so. I think the self-care emphasis is also important. In any sort of prescription that we are sort of tossing about in our discussion today, there's always got to be that fine balance, because obviously there is a way in which exclusively taking care of others can result in us not taking care of ourselves and then not being able to show up for them, right? So I think there is a way in which we often set high standards for ourselves in how we show up for others, and that's a great thing. And I think at this time, perhaps we also need to be a little bit easy on ourselves. This is, I say almost easy to say that we need to be easy on ourselves, but that sense of responsibility can sometimes drive us to work ourselves extremely hard. So I think this is a matter of fine balance. Showing up for others is a great thing to indulge in, is a great way to be present, be there for others, fulfill our duties. But you're absolutely right. We need to take care of ourselves, especially if not taking care of ourselves compromises what we can do for others.
And when we're talking about self-care, we're not talking about anything particularly strenuous, right? We're talking about sleeping well, making sure we're getting enough rest, that we're eating properly, that we're hydrating properly, that we're getting outside and getting benefits of the sunshine and the fresh air, and maybe disengaging from the news, although that might be very difficult, right? Because we're moths to the flame in this period.
Right. Right. Because, one of the ways in which one might recommend taking care of ourselves is to seek out our friends, to talk to them, to engage, to share our feelings. And in these kinds of conversations, once again, there's that need for balance. If our conversations with our friends turn into a kind of amplification of our angst, right? We're sort of meeting each other and feeding off of each other's angst and sort of, as it were, raising the volume levels on our stress, then that might not be so conducive. On the other hand, if we can seek out friends with whom we can perhaps share our fears, talk about our disappointments, this might be sometimes people might have these kinds of conversations with their counselors or therapists, which I think is, quite likely in today's world.
Yes,
But I
the
think
spike.
right. But I think very much the kinds of resources that people will seek out will be the kinds of resources that they might have relied upon on in similar instances in the past. Going out for a walk with a friend, making sure that the kind of schedule that we have set for ourselves is at least in our minds as an approximate target to be adhered to, right? I
Yeah.
might not stick to the 5 components of my daily schedule, but if it's there present as a kind of a sanity template and some parts of it fall out, that's fine. But maybe at least stick to that template. At least we get out of bed, attempt to move, continue to take care of those who depend upon us, fulfill our duties at work to the best that we can. I had to teach the day after the 2016 election. I taught all my classes of the day, but all my students wanted to talk about the election, and I let them have that space. I wasn't a stickler and said, no, we got to get through this 20 pages of reading that I assigned last week. And I don't care that this is, the Wednesday after the election. My students wanted to talk. They wanted to air their, and I had quite a mixed student body. Some people were happy with the election result. Some people were not happy. And in fact, it actually led to an interesting discussion amongst my students. And watching my students debate the election result was actually quite a relief for me, because I had the feeling, well, here are young folks. They're the ones who are going to be the most affected by these results. Here they are talking with their peers. I've actually created a space for them. So my feelings on the day after that election was that I was dealing with my disappointment in the best way possible by being there for my students and allowing them to talk through these results with their classmates in a way, honestly, that I felt was quite respectful. And I was quite proud of my students at the end of the day. They had their own political differences, but I think in that classroom, they handled it quite well.
So what I'm hearing you say also is that the space that you had created in that classroom allowed for a civil discourse, right? Allowed for people to actually talk to one another and acknowledge that there were different views. And here we are. And this is the reality, although it's hard for us to see that. Like, the world is going to go on,
Right.
disappointment is actually an enduring experience that we will have throughout our lifetimes.
You bet. I mean, I would say life is
It's a
is like
guarantee, like death and
that's right.
taxes.
We're sort of jumping from the valleys of disappointments to the peaks of success all the time. So
Yes.
there's this kind of up and down, and this is in some ways is precisely the deal. Not that we were promised this deal when we were brought into the world, but it's one that we've figured out by now, that there are going to be these kinds of crushing disappointments, and this one, in its shape and form, is going to be in many ways similar to ones we have suffered in the past. And trust me, there'll be other ones like it in the future, right? The idea that this is the worst or the most singular, that is probably not going to be the case. Life will have many more surprises for us, and some of them unpleasant down the road. That's just...
Yeah, it's the most up until this moment, right? Up until
Yes,
now. It's the most.
that's right.
The
Up
ultra.
until now, because this is the moment we're experiencing it. It's like taking up all our space. But trust me, there'll be other ones down the line as well.
The contrast heightens the awareness, right? Like to say we've had others, there will be more. We're in it this moment. We will get through it. I find comfort in that, which is the point of this conversation. Let's take a pause.
Exactly.
And when we come back, we will return to the conversation with Samir Chopra. To learn more, please go to samirchopra.com. You can also find him on psychologytoday.com. We're also talking about his book, Anxiety, A Philosophical Guide. We'll be right back. Harvesting Happiness is rooted in science. Our work facilitates applied positive psychology practices through media and consulting. We're committed to sound ideas for better well-being, leading to increased life satisfaction and a better world for everyone. We're not into pseudoscience or quick fixes. We're focused on common sense backed by rigorous research. Healthy critical thinking is the foundation for our discussions. We encourage you to challenge preconceptions and explore ideas with a curiously discerning mind. Collaboration with our guests is united by an inclusive vision to boost resilience, critical thinking, communication, and problem solving through civilized discourse and pleasurable relational engagement for everyone. Each day, we have the intellectual freedom to be happy or the liberty to be miserable, regardless of external circumstances. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, please seek support because good psychological health is vital to the achievement of a healthy and satisfying life. Visit harvestinghappiness.com for psychosocial and educational services that boost emotional and social intelligence. And we're back, continuing our conversation with Dr. Samir Chopra. We're having a philosophical discourse on disappointment. Let's get back to it. So, Samir, you so eloquently labeled the sanity template as one way for us to help self-regulate and ground ourselves in times of uncertainty. And I'd love for you to sort of use that to talk about how we hyper-focus on things. And the election season just happens to be the flavor of the moment.
Right. I think that point about hyperfocus is interesting in the following way. If you think about our expectations being dashed, our confronting disappointment, our constructing a vision of a life that doesn't have the shape and form that we wanted it to be. If you think about it a little bit more closely and reflect on it, this is something that we do all the time on a daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly basis. At any given time, we have certain sets of expectations for the future. And as we go through the day, the week, the month, the year, we find out that some of those expectations are met and some of those expectations are dashed. So one thing I want to reassure people about this, you're already an expert or already a veteran in some ways at handling disappointments. If you look back on your life, you've had many disappointments in your life up till this point. And like I said, one, realistic way of looking at the life that lies ahead of you is that you will have many more disappointments as well. That's the nature of life. So in this sense, the election result that we have witnessed that has left people disappointed, this has become a kind of container into which we have poured all our current expectations. The dashing of this election result means at this moment, some kind of catastrophic global disappointment or dashing of expectations has taken place. Now, once the proverbial sort of smoke is cleared, a few things will still remain. And I think this is, something we learn from sportsmen, the day after a big game or in the press conference after a big game, and someone says, man, you lost that final, the last second, you lost the game. Now, how do you deal with this? And sometimes, you'll hear players say things like, man, no one died. I still got my wife and kids. Yeah. And there's a way in which you try to put it into perspective, right? So I think this is a very important maneuver that we always engage in, and we have engaged in it. We look at the remains of the disaster that's lying around us, and we say, well, there's some stuff that still remains. I have myself, I have my family, I have my people around me, I have work to do. So these are the things that bring us back to sanity in some ways. They focus our minds. They put things into perspective. Some expectations have been dashed, but a great deal of our life is still there, functioning, waiting for us to come back and take charge of it, right? So I think these maneuvers, they're maneuvers that we've relied upon in the past. Sometimes we have taken duties to bring us back to sanity. Sometimes we have told ourselves, well, the most important people in the world are still there for me. We remind ourselves of the blessings that we have. We sometimes give gratitude for what remains for us. I think those maneuvers, they're things that we should remember when we confront the next big disappointment or the next big dashing of expectations of our lives. And this election result is one dramatic instance of that, because it's nationwide. Everyone has a reaction to it. We've been talking about it for so long. And in a way, we've been primed to have this kind of reaction to it in some ways, right?
I would argue that it's not just the United States, right? The world has been watching with the same anxiety, the same anticipation.
Very much
And
so.
I would love for you to touch upon violence, political action and political violence, because although I doubt those who are listening to this podcast are focusing on a peaceful approach to managing their anxiety, but we hope that we can reach them. And violence is not the answer, because when we are in this state of violence, we're not properly functioning in our brains. Executive functioning has gone out the window. It's disconnected.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a difficult topic to talk about in the context of politics, in the context of our national politics. We are often exposed to either what I would call implicit or explicit violence. There can be the threat of violence hanging in the air. That can be a sense of apprehension surrounding the election as we'd approached it, and then there can be a sense of violence in the air when we think about the aftermath as well. Right. That can be part of the anxiety, given our nation's history, given what the election. I think that's, for some people, that's a justifiable fear. Given our nation's, I would say, ongoing political scene and the gun violence in our nation, that is, I think, a concern that often, I think, for a lot of parents, for instance, it's like a low-grade anxiety that they always have. My daughter has a lockdown drill, I think, planned for today at 9:30 in the morning. And you get a parental notice, and it's strange for me to think that this is something that my child is exposed to at such a young age. So I think we have to acknowledge this is something that not just us adults, but our children are exposed to as well. Our children hear our discussions of violence. They themselves wonder what might be coming down the pike for themselves, their parents. So I think violence as a kind of tactic that's available to us. As you pointed out in the domain of politics, it's a very dangerous tactic or a very dangerous weapon, a very dangerous tool. Of course, violence has always been associated with certain forms of politics, certain forms of national and international politics. In our country, it's an unfortunate feature of our political life now. At this moment, I would hope and pray that it's not in the cards, but as an option for someone, I would say you're right. There's something terribly self-destructive and corrosive about giving into the anger that serves as the initiator of a violence, right?
Yeah.
Even I think fantasies of violence, right? They might be cathartic in the moment and sort of giving us this, curious gratification or thrill, but there isn't a way to make that a coherent, constructive reaction to this that doesn't involve hurting ourselves and others.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, ultimately, psychological safety for everyone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just those who
Yes.
think like me. The idea that
Yes.
those who don't think like me actually.
Deep point, Lisa. If those who are even as those that I perceive as my enemies, I think this is the deep for this point. Even those I perceive as my enemies, I would like them to feel safe and secure, because my safety lies in their feeling safe and secure.
Yes.
I don't want to be perceived as a threat by them, and I certainly don't want them, and I certainly don't want to see them as a threat. And the only way to do that is to have as much concern for other people's safety and security as we have for others. When we think about Buddhist claims about universalist ethics, it's not just your suffering that you need to be worried about. You need to be worried about everyone's suffering.
Yeah.
Because other people in this world are suffering and you aren't. I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to have the peaceful existence that you want. Right? There is no way to make the reduction of suffering into a purely personal project. I think this is the deep Buddhist insight, right? It has to be for everyone, because if other people are angry in this world and I am calm and serene, guess what? Their anger is going to wash up on my shore as well. Yeah. Right? So this has to be something that I'm thinking about others as well.
And I think this is sometimes the portal for the conversation, to ask another person to tell me, tell me more about your anger. I want to learn more, because that's in part what has, I think, caused the great divide, right? Is an unwillingness to listen, an unwillingness to appreciate that we have different opinions, from one another, but that doesn't make us separate.
Lisa, I've just been thinking, just by what you said, that one of the best things that we could probably do at this time is we are looking to unburden ourselves to share our feelings with others. Well, how about we do that by expressing concern outwards first, right? Call up a friend, ask them, do you want to talk about this? Well, if so, I'm here to listen, right?
Yes.
Now, we're not even saying to them that I want to say something to you. We're simply offering ourselves as a listening post, right? And in that listening, in helping them unburden, we'll be helping someone deal with their disappointment, their expectation. That's a moment for connection with someone else. That's a moment of maybe in that process, making it clear to them that you also would like to talk about your disappointment, right? And I think in that way, that offering of help, opening yourself to hearing others, you have reached out, touched another human being, and helped one person at least talk about how they're feeling on this day, right?
Yeah.
So I think that can be quite a powerful way of connecting with others in this moment. There's an old saying in many religions that a grief shared is a grief lessened, right? And in some ways, to be able to open up to you is to also make it clear that I'm here for you, I'm ready to listen to you, and in the hope that we'll also receive that opportunity to share what we're feeling with others.
It's a constructive pity party.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
In which, excuse me, that whining, being able to allocate time to process that is super important. That's like not like shut up and carry on. It's let's pay this appropriate attention, and
very much so,
and then find ways to move on.
Yeah. One of the general ways in which we can think about dealing with a crisis situation, or actually I would say the only three options that we have for dealing with a bad situation is either we escape, right? Or and I think we talked about this, either we escape, I remove myself from that situation. And, there are people who might do that. They might say, well, I'm going to go to Canada or something like that. That's entirely possible, right? Or you could change the situation. You can engage in activism. You can now sit down and think, okay, so, maybe is there some work I want to do that would help me ameliorate the effects of this election result as far as my politics is concerned? I think that's a great outlet, right? Think about the activism you can engage yourself in.
Be the change you wish to see,
Be the change you wish to see, buckle down. Lots of people I know after both of the previous election results, they rolled up their sleeves, pat on their hands, and got down to work. That itself can be very, cathartic. And the third option is to reconstrue, which has happened. The election result is final. It's not going to be overthrown, right? We have now a new political reality for the next 4 years. And we need to reconcile ourselves to that reality and find a space for ourselves within it, right?
That is the perfect moment to end this episode of Harvesting Happiness. But join us over on Substack and Medium for our bonus series, continuing the Good Citizens Election Season Survival Guide, Restoring Common Sense and Sanity in a Crazy World. My guest today has been Samir Chopra. You can find him on samirchopra.com. Also on Psychology Today. We've been talking about elements of his latest book, Anxiety, A Philosophical Guide. Thanks, Samir.
Thank you very much for having me on, Lisa. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us today on Harvesting Happiness and this special edition of the Good Citizens Election Season Survival Guide, helping to restore common sense in a crazy world. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen on behalf of my guest, Dr. Samir Chopra, wishing you kind thoughts, kinder words, and the kindest of actions. Until next time, remember, happiness is an inside job. Happiness is your inside job. Please go out and rock your day and remember to be kind to one another. This conversation with Dr. Samir Chopra continues as a bonus episode over at More Mental Fitness by Harvesting Happiness on Substack and Medium. Want to explore more sound ideas for better well-being? You can listen to part 2 of this conversation and the Good Citizens Election Season Survival Guide to Restoring Common Sense and Sanity in a Crazy World at More Mental Fitness by Harvesting Happiness on Substack and Medium. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Connect with and follow us on most social media channels. To learn more about lifestyle management and mental fitness consulting services, please visit harvestinghappiness.com. Harvesting Happiness and More Mental Fitness are produced by Lisa Cypers Kamen, Andrea Mengele, Robin Boyd, Andrea Daly, and the excellent team at Podfly Productions, including Eric Begay, Kimberly Beck, and Alec Guess, in collaboration with TogiNet Radio, KBUU, RadioMalibu.net, and is available on PRX, the Public Radio Exchange.